Today we're going to take a look at knitting needle sizing and the history behind these various systems. You might want to sit down for this one. It's pretty wild. There are three basic systems that are in use today: the metric, the US system, and the British system. When we started nearly 30 years ago, the US sizing system was standard. Domestic patterns would almost exclusively reference US sizing only. Domestic brands of needles would simply list the US size with no reference whatsoever to the metric equivalent. So when knitters would encounter a foreign brand with metric references, many Americans would just be lost. There was still great resistance to the metric system in our country, and many people just weren't ready to adapt. Change was inevitable, and as the yarn world exploded on the international stage, thanks to the internet, reconciling the metric and US system became imperative. This wasn't as easy as it sounds, especially since the US sizing system didn't exactly conform to specific measurements. More on that in a minute. Today you will see both the US and metric size referenced on a needle package. The diameter of the needle will be the metric size, with the closest corresponding US size referenced as well. Again, US sizes aren't completely standardized measurements. I can think of no better example for promoting the use of the metric system than with knitting needles. With both the US and metric system, as the size numbers get larger, so do the size of the needles. Seems simple enough. Not exactly. The lack of compatibility between the US and metric systems has resulted in various fractional sizes, such as a 1.5, a 2.5, a 10.5, 10.75, and these fractional sizes sometimes weren't even the same. Size 10.5 and 10.75 were one of my biggest headaches when chunky knits became the rage 20 years ago. Depending on the manufacturer, a size 10.5 might be a 6.5 millimeter, or it might be a 7 millimeter. Some companies would call a 7 millimeter a 10.75. And then there was even a 10.875 needle. It got so confusing. If you combine brands and purchased a needle that was marked 10.5 and one marked 10.75, thinking they'd be different sizes, they might actually have been the same size. Knitters resistant to the metric system just couldn't see past the US size on the package. I get blue in the face trying to explain that they were buying the same size needle, even though the package said that they were different. I can only do so much. At one point, there were even a 4 and a 4.25 millimeter on the needle, both marked US 6, obviously not the same size. Fortunately, manufacturers seem to have standardized most of these discrepancies, but issues still exist, especially with the 1.5 and 2.5 needles. Audi calls a size 2.5 millimeter a size 1, and a size 3 millimeter a size 2. Most other brands consider these sizes 1.5 and 2.5. Audi's 2.25 and 2.75 needles don't list a US size on them at all, but these would be a size 1 and 2 in other brands. So the confusion, it's still there. Bottom line, look at the millimeter. The US size can be pretty useless. You'll see why in a minute. If you think all of the US and millimeter size stuff is weird, the British sizing system, even weirder. Their size numbers run counter to the actual size of the needles. As the sizes get bigger, the UK size number gets smaller. It's like the upside down of needle sizing. Unless you're using a very old British pattern, you fortunately won't ever have to worry about this. As crazy as needle sizes may seem, the system has really come together over the years. To truly understand the needle sizing system, we'll need to peek into the history of knitting needles. Very little is written on this topic, especially the sizing system. I had to do a deep dive myself, scrounging for information across every corner of the web. The best source is a woman named Susan Webster from Australia. I recommend reading her numerous articles on this topic. You'll find them online. There's also an out-of-print book, The History of Knitting Pin Gauges from Sheila Williams, but it's considered a rare book and is like $200, so I had to pass on that. Maybe one day I'll get lucky and nab a copy. What I was able to determine from my research is mind-blowingly nuts. The first knitting needles invented were straight needles, or pins as the British like to call them. The British actually came up with the first sizing system based on the standard British wire gauge, which explains their weird sizes. It wasn't until the late 1880s that the US even bothered to think about needle sizes. The manufacturers each had their own sizing systems. While it is possible that these sizes corresponded to something, the best I can describe is these systems were basically random numbers with physical sizes that don't correspond to anything in particular at all. Can you imagine if each of our yarn companies had their very own needles and sizing system referenced in their yarn and patterns? It would be crazy. Double point needles were the only other type of needle around at that time, and they had a completely separate sizing system that differed depending on the type of material that they were made from. Steel needles were sized differently than those made from celluloid or bone. Material differences even affected straight needles. The early synthetic needles, called amber, were sized differently than bone, wood, or metal needles. Because of all this wackiness, needle gauges started appearing. Each company had a gauge to go with their needles, and eventually gauges would try to cram all the different sizing and discrepancy onto one single gauge. It was wild. Gauges were especially important back then because they didn't have sizes affixed to the needles. One of the early attempts was when they took tiny pieces of paper and pasted them to the needle shaft. And well, that didn't work well for obvious reasons. By the 1940s, knitting became serious business thanks to the war effort. The main manufacturers of needles back then were Boy, Susan Bates, and Hero. Eventually, they moved to a more common American sizing system, but Boy still insisted on keeping their very own special sizing system just for their steel double points. I guess they couldn't just totally go with the flow. These needle brands were such a staple in the American market, and they were very resistant to adopt to metric standardization, even as superior European needles started flooding the market. When we got our start nearly 30 years ago, we were in the midst of this wave of change, and we were still working through the kinks of all the size standardization. Circular needles didn't appear until the early 1900s with Arrow twin pen needles. These British needles were the first on the market. Personally, I find it odd that the British basically invented circular needles but resist using them for some reason. Crazy. Needle gauges are still an important tool, and that the sizes stamped on the needles can wear off or become very hard to read. If you have an older gauge like this, I recommend getting a new one, especially if it's a Boy or Susan Bates gauge without the millimeter sizes. I keep this one on hand simply because I like the ruler bit. As far as a needle sizer, this is pretty useless unless you're using very old Boy needles. One of my prized new possessions is this cardboard Boy needle gauge from the 1930s. It has all the different sizes and recommendations on what to use and tips on the back. I'm surprised many of these survived as they did, but I love it. I think it's kind of cool. Don't know if I'd actually ever use it, but I kind of am a freak for history. So I've got this now in my collection, and I also managed to acquire this somewhat rare, from what I understand, knit-a-majig. I mean, I've never seen one of these before. They're from the 1970s. I don't think they made very many of them. I just like to have these because they're historic and cool. With knitting needles and gauges, older is never better. You'll definitely want to use more modern tools. We have a wide variety of gauges for nearly every type of needle. Some are functional with a wide array of sizes. Some are functional and cute. And some are just really cute. We even have our very own custom-made lips shape gauge. Also, I'm curious to know, does anyone else out there have a knit-a-majig? If so, let me know. We may need to form a knit-a-majig club.